Dallas was a wonderful place to grow up if you were, well, like me. So if you were Christian, you were a guy, you played football, you were a Boy Scout, you were straight, sort of normal list, then it was a really good place to grow up. If you deviated in any way, if you were black, if you were gay, if you were Jewish, if you didn't play football, it was brutal. It was really quite a brutal place. But for me, it was a great place to grow up. And I did play high school football. I was taught to be agile, hostile, and mobile, thus presaging what
your life. What kind of high school was it?
I went to W.T. White High School, big public high school.
Mm-hmm. A lot of integrated.
In fact, until I went to college, I never met anyone who went to a private school. I mean, we thought private schools were for kids who had problems.
So you grew up in Texas because your father was involved in the oil business, I understand. And so you were kind of center of the universe in those days. I mean, the oil industry was booming in that period, was it not? I mean,
I think playing football was more important
than what your father did. You then left Texas and went to the left coast to go to college, right?
I went to Stanford.
And how long was your hair when you were in Stanford? You started in 1971, just to sort of.
Oh, can I tell another football story?
Sure. You didn't play football at Stanford, though.
No, in fact, I promised my mother that I wouldn't play football at Stanford because I had a significant kidney injury my senior year in football and woke up peeing blood one day. And in a moment of weakness, I promised my mother I wouldn't play football at Stanford, so I played rugby. Yeah.
And how's your kidney?
So I learned how to negotiate early. Oh, but I do want to tell a story about football. So how many of you, I know Joseph was too young for this, remember the 1970 mobilization against the war, right? So I was in high school at the time, and Dallas was a pretty right-wing place, and I wasn't a left-wing person by any means, though I went to a church that was one of two anti-war churches in Dallas. So it came time on a Friday before the big mobilization, and Friday Night Lights, Friday is football day. So two kids put up a banner, holding up a banner, a little teeny banner, that said, "Negotiate now." So if any of you sort of followed opposition to the war, in 1970, negotiate now was not a left-wing position. And two of my fellow football players saw this, ran across the street, ripped it down, beat the shit out of it. So over the intercom, 5 minutes later came, and you were supposed to wear an armband if you opposed the war. So these two guys were expelled for inciting violence. So not the ones who beat them up, the ones who held the banner, because clearly they had incited violence. Over the intercom came, if you have an armband on, you have 5 minutes to take it off, or you too will be expelled. This was too far, so I put it on an armband. This is on Friday. So I went the whole day until the sort of afternoon rally. So in Friday in Dallas, the whole school is required. You probably would be expelled if you didn't go to the rally. With this armband on. And if you're a starter on the football team, you're up on the stage, you have assigned pep squad girls. I mean, it's really nauseating. Nobody said a word. Not a word. Because it was football. So it was a very clear lesson, which was if you have privilege, however attained, then you have to find a way to use it. Now, of course, that's true for, almost everything I've done. Right, so we started a business because businesses have privilege in a capitalist society. It's a great platform from which to do politics. But it all goes back to that.
That's fascinating. I don't think I've ever heard that story.
Well, there
Yeah,
you go.
there you go. So when you were, how come you didn't go to the University of Texas? How come you went to Stanford? What was the attraction?
Well, my father and I visited Stanford, and probably a third of the windows were broken because there'd just been a big fight over lasers and smart bombs and blah, blah, blah. I thought this was very exciting. Coming from Texas, it seemed like Stanford was close to the ocean, close to San Francisco, and I was a big Grateful Dead fan at the time, close to the mountains. I mean, it just seemed perfect. So
you went to Stanford.
And they had the Stanford Band, which was really cool. So I went to Stanford.
The famous Stanford Band that ruined
Stanford
the
band.
big game.
Yeah.
Yeah. Was that not? That wasn't during your era, was it?
I played in the band a couple of times.
Did you?
Yeah.
Did you go running on the field in the middle of the game?
No, my job. So Stanford's big rival is Cal, of course, and I had one of my best friends played the tuba, and during Berkeley Stanford games, the other side would try and pelt the band with water balloons launched by great engineered contraptions. And my job was to play the kazoo and watch for the water balloon. Because you can imagine if a water balloon hit the tuba, it would break somebody's mouth. So yeah, I was a member of the band.
Did you also play defense when you were playing rugby? No, I'm just kidding.
Okay.
So,
let's get to the business.
no, not quite. You did you become an activist during your period at Stanford?
What does that mean?
Well, you described that you weren't terribly political when you were in high school. Obviously, you became political at some point. I'm just trying to figure out when.
Well, it's a journey. I don't think there is a moment.
There wasn't a particular thing?
I mean, I think that the things I did in high school, I wouldn't call them activist. I mean, if anything, I remember a time at Stanford, there was a march. So some of you have probably been to Stanford. There's this great road that leads in. And there was going to be a march from Palo Alto, organized by churches, of course, candles, and students walked to meet them. And we walked sort of one way, and it was sort of a moment of...
It was about the war, I take it?
It was about the war, and Stanford's complicity in the war. And there was a moment where there were all these buses filled with attack teams, sort of in the trees. This is not a good sign, right? Really
attack squads were
not a good
the
sign.
Response of the authorities to.
And so, of course, march comes up, all the candles, and then the police tell them you have to leave or you'll be arrested. And of course, everyone sat down. It's all peaceful, not violent. And you got 3 warnings, and then they just charged. Just charged. Beat the shit out of people. And I remember being one of maybe 3 people in my freshman dorm who went. And there was a lecturer in Spanish who had his skull fractured. And I was cradling his head, he was bleeding all over. And it was quite a moment to walk back to my dorm, covered with blood. And of course, people were watching, Star Trek. So that cognitive dissonance was a moment.
Profound.
Yeah.
So when you left Stanford, you then went straight to Sacramento? Is that, or am I missing a step? But you ended up working...
I went to graduate school.
Okay.
I went to the Kennedy School.
Right.
In fact, it was while I was at the Kennedy School working on my dissertation that I was hired to do consulting work on development. Went to Arkansas, this will again reveal how old I am, and consulted with Clinton when he was governor, and met all the Whitewater people.
Really?
So of course there were real crimes with Whitewater. There was all sorts of normal Arkansas corruption, but that was That's the sort of thing I did.
So then after graduate school, you ended up working for Governor Brown.
Yes.
The first term of the now governor of California.
Governor Moonbeam.
Governor Moonbeam. What did you do? What did you accomplish? What was that experience like, and how did it inform where you left there to go do?
Well, it was thrilling in some ways. I mean, this was post-Prop 13, right? So I had accepted a job in California before Prop 13, and then there was a hiring freeze. So this is post-Prop 13 when resources are really scarce. So we've entered the era of scarcity, which we're still, frankly, in California. It's only gotten worse in some ways. So I was Brown's economics advisor, and anyone who knows Jerry Brown knows that he goes hot and cold on everything. So for a month you might be involved in everything, and then you get disappeared because you said the wrong thing. But among the things that I did, that I worked on, that I'm most proud of, is we had the best energy efficiency measures. We set up all sorts of solar programs. I created a small bank, state bank, for a solar program. So we did lots of good things. We invested pension funds. We changed the rules on pension funds. At the time we came in, they were only allowed to invest in bonds. And we changed the rules so they can invest in alternative investments, venture capital, housing. So we did a lot of things. And I worked on his Senate campaign, where I became the Social Security expert. The issues are no different than they are now. The rhetoric's really no different. So I learned a lot.
And that pulled you into the private sector, was that experience?
Well, that's a really good question.
I hope so.
So I'm quite agnostic. I mean, I should say I'm agnostic about the platform for social change. I think that change can come from almost any vehicle. It can come from the state, it can come from academia, it can come from nonprofits, for-profits, religious institutions. And so it's a sort of, you have to match your own inclination with the issue to sort of pick a platform. So I feel like I've worked at every single platform. And at that moment, my choice was between taking an academic job, because I'd gotten my PhD and I got offered a job to spend the next 7 years trying to achieve tenure, or trying to start something. I was actually quite worried that, having worked for Brown, I was unemployable, because Brown did not have a good reputation.
Right.
And so I applied for a job with a group, and was thrilled to be offered it. So I then turned it down, knowing that, at least for the moment, I was employable. And embarked on trying to start things. And in that year helped to start 2 companies, one of which became, of course, Working Assets.
So let's talk about Working Assets in its early days. What was it? How did it work? Why were you attracted to it?
Well, the original Working Assets was a money market fund. So it was it was the second socially minded money market fund. Calvert did the first one. And all of us had the notion that mobilizing capital for good things was important. Now, it's important to say a money market fund doesn't mobilize capital for good things. So none of us were sort of naive enough to believe that. The notion was that if you could build a big enough pool of safe money over time, you could create riskier and riskier. And my particular interest at the time was I wanted to eventually have a fund for worker ownership. And a whole bunch of us, including Peter Barnes, who many of you know, went on a long hike in Desolation Wilderness, where we argued about whether or not starting a money market fund was just too safe, right? But because none of us really had any credibility whatsoever in doing this, we thought it was a good idea. listening to Billy yesterday talk about Solar Mosaic reminded me, one of the other founders, Jerry Dodson, had been the president of Continental Savings and Loan. And I personally first met, I've just blanked. So I'll change it just a little bit. He had a solar CD program. Do you remember that, Eric? Yeah. Right? So basically you could put a CD into an insured account, and Jerry would promise to loan the money for a solar installation. Money flowed in, right? This is pre-internet, high friction, government regulations, blah, 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 blah. And that was one of the things that convinced us it was possible to mobilize money. Now, it had insurance, it had lots of things that we didn't have, but that was important. Now, we never got to
the other things.
The other things.
What happened? I mean, I know I was part of this. To confess,
well,
I
it was your fault, really.
Yeah, oh, it was my fault. Sure. I take the responsibility.
Well, two things happened, and they're very different. One is it was really hard. It was really, really hard to get enough money. I mean, the money fund got to be $100 million, but that in some sense is trivial for what we wanted to accomplish. The other is that Peter Barnes, who, for those who know him, is among the most inventive minds in the world, was smoking a joint in his hot tub and somehow at the same time watching television. I've never quite figured this out. And he saw an ad where American Express promised to donate something like 1/1000th of a penny if you use the American Express card to the Statue of Liberty renovation campaign. Lee Iacocca was, pushing this. And he said, why don't we do that? And so we did, but we did it with a Visa card. Right. We went to State Street Bank of Boston and signed up under an affiliate program with them. And it just exploded. Can I tell a story about that?
Yes.
So one of the hardest moments was when we got called back to meet with State Street. And we thought things were going really well. So we got there and we're told, you have 60 days to leave. We no longer want to do business with you. And so what had happened, well, we from very early on have been a big supporter of Planned Parenthood. We've given them over $2 million. We're the biggest corporate supporter of Planned Parenthood. And so we bragged about this in a newsletter, and we had the right to insert quarterly newsletters into the statements of State Street. Well, being State Street, they'd made a mistake, and they inserted our newsletter into the Archbishop of Boston. And yeah, so
you couldn't make this one up.
You couldn't make it up. And so he called the head of State Street, and we had to leave. So we have always had a slightly paranoid point of view about, because we almost always partner with bigger, more powerful institutions. And some of them don't like that. Right? So we always have to worry about that.
So it came to pass that the money fund and the credit card separated as companies, and some of us went one direction, some of us went the other direction.
There was a divorce.
There was a divorce.
Yes.
It was a large group. Hard to hold a large group in a startup business setting. With the new business, which was a credit card business, how did you get to this idea of going into the phone business?
Well, it's pretty obvious in some ways. So
Not
way
everybody
back then, right, the notion of a credit card was credit cards are pretty much all alike. What can you do where there's multiple suppliers, there's a wholesale margin, and if you, in this case working assets, have a lower cost to acquire a customer than the big entity, they should want, politics aside, to do business with you. Because it should bring them more volume. So we did that with credit cards. So we started out looking, what else can we do? We tried many things. We tried health insurance. That didn't work very well. Travel, that didn't work very well. The long-distance business was deregulating. AT&T was being broken up, and so there was a wholesale margin, and we were able to enter that business. And the nicest thing about the business was we figured out a way to do our own billing. So in the credit card world, the banks did the billing, so you couldn't use it as, in a sense, a free way of communicating. By taking on the billing in long distance, we had a newsletter that people wanted to read just to find out what they owed every month, and we could start our political program. And so we started doing monthly actions. And the first actions, you didn't ask this, but the first actions we did were to the first George Bush, not to impose the gag rule on international family planning activities, which comes and goes with great regularity, and to General Motors not to shut down the electric car. Sorry, so it is unfortunately the case that many of the things we worked on, and this is in 1991, are still relevant. Right? These things go on long cycles, and if I've learned anything, is you have to be both urgent and patient. You can't be, if you're just urgent, it doesn't work. If you're just patient, I mean, you lose in both cases. You have to be both.
So this was in the early 90s, and the phone companies had broken up, and so reselling long distance was actually a business that many people tried to get into. There was sort of a unique partnership that you established with an SVN company at the time that helped your marketing. Tell us about that.
Oh, you're trying to lead the witness.
I am. It's really difficult.
We had a partnership with Ben & Jerry's. It basically was the case that if you signed up with us, then we'd give you free ice cream. And so, without any doubt at all, we were responsible for more weight gain than any other phone company. Now, there were some, I mean, it's worth saying two things that were troublesome in the relationship. Ben was always concerned that we were giving away what he thought of as a premium product for free, and that would diminish their brand. Right, so there's always a point of contention. And the other was, which we can come back to, you know, Ben & Jerry's is a progressive company even after their sale, but they definitely are not progressive on all things. On many things, they're just silent. Choice is an example, right? So they have much more been an anti-war, pro-environment company, and you know we're against the death penalty for gay marriage, for reproductive rights, against attacking Iran. I mean, you sort of, you know, the full list. And they had an informal quota, which thankfully we never violated. And if I recall right, if they got more than 12 complaints that they were killing babies, then they would shut us off. And thankfully, that
didn't happen. So how quickly did it grow?
We went from, we should ask Deb that. We went from 2 million in 91. What was the revenue when you left?
It was over 100 million.
Yeah, it was over 100 million. So it went from 2 to over 100 million.
In what period of time?
10 years.
Not bad. There were a number of sort of noteworthy actions during this period because the customer engagement through the billings allowed people to make free phone calls. Tell us the story about the Federal Reserve. Do you remember the story about the Federal Reserve? I can tell you the story.
Why don't you tell that one?
There was a point at which I think you called for an action against Alan Greenspan, who was then the chairman of the Federal Reserve, with regard to low-income housing lending rates. Or there was something, it was a lending rate issue, and you asked people to call his office. Do you remember this?
Yeah.
Now you can tell the story.
Well, we worked with the Center for Responsible Lending on predatory lending practices, and the Fed, you know, to their utter and enduring shame, never issued rules which would have limited, you know, what came to be the foreclosure crisis on predatory lending. And on that, as in many other ones, it's sort of a fire hose. So if we unleashed it, he would get 20,000 phone calls. And Alan Greenspan is not used to the impertinence of the public. So that's what we did.
There was a story about that they called your office and said, "Who are you?" or something to that effect,
true.
Right? Yeah.
And just for fun, some of you may know where we now have our offices. We're in the Federal Reserve Bank building of San Francisco. And I will tell you a secret if you promise not to tell them. But you really have to promise not to tell them. Okay. So the reason that we're in the Federal Reserve Bank building, it's a very high security building, as you can imagine. It's much harder than most places, is that we got lots of bomb threats, usually over choice, but over some other things too, and we started to lose employees. It's a scary thing to evacuate the building. That's not fun. And you never know, police would come, but you never know whether or not they're real or not, but you have to evacuate. And I remember at one point the police with a dog is asking me, "Are there any lunch bags you don't recognize?" I mean, what a stupid question. So it's much easier to move into the Fed with all of its security. And, thankfully, the bomb threat stopped. We still get death threats and stuff like that, but we don't get bomb threats anymore. So it's a very good move.
For those of you who haven't visited Michael, you have to go through literally airport-level security to have a cup of coffee. So the company is growing like gangbusters through the 90s, and then policy changes, and the long-distance business changes, or structurally. So what happened then, and how did you get to doing what you do now, which is sell mobile?
Okay, so that's a complicated question, but I'm going to go really fast because we're not getting to the really
well, we're about to, so I'm just
basically,
trying to make the transition.
The telecom industry was changed in '96, right, under Clinton. There's a big sort of reform act. And the behemoths of telecom lobbied Congress, and in the end, what we think of as long distance made a deal with what we thought of as local, where long distance would be able to resell local, and the local could do long distance. And for a variety of reasons, that deal fell apart. So we had started to resell local, which is very popular, and then the courts overruled that decision, and within a month, AT&T, MCI, and Sprint were all sold to other companies. So the long distance industry, as we once knew it, went poof. Mobile was starting to happen, and so we went into mobile. It's worth saying that the mobile business is a super different industry than the long distance industry. So in the mobile industry, I mean, today, of course, it's a very intimate service. You carry around with you your life. Right? I mean, it's just a very different thing. So we could give a pint of ice cream. We could encourage people with a pint of ice cream or 12 pints of ice cream to switch in the long distance days. Much harder to get people to switch in the mobile days. Ice cream doesn't do it anymore. Ben & Jerry's has suffered because of this regulatory change. And so we struggled in the mobile business. In fact, I mean, we grew, but long distance was going like this, mobile was going like that. That's not a very good rate of exchange. By 2007, some people at the company decided that we should change the name. We eventually did, from Working Assets to CREDO. I thought then, and I think now, is a terrible choice, but we did it. And we had a VP of marketing at the time who thought that what we needed to do in response to the changes was soften our approach. We needed to be sort of light green. And during a time when we weren't doing so well, we tried that. Didn't work, really didn't work. So we did something very different. We sort of went back to where we were, but even more aggressive. Sort of did what we really wanted to do, sort of unleashed our inner activist, and that worked much better.
So talk about the numbers, and then let's talk about the substance of the activism.
Can I show a slide?
Sure.
Okay, I don't know if I can do this right here.
No, that's the wrong device.
One. Where's the thing?
There.
Okay. This will be really brief. Okay. So I think everybody knows we give away money. We give away general support money, which is really helpful to groups. So we've now given away about, since we started, $75 million in general support funding. And it grows pretty steadily because it's a percentage of revenues. Just for those who don't, it's not a percentage of profits, designed to be off the top line, not off the bottom line, so that if we don't make any money, we still give money. Lots of groups do it off the bottom line, which I don't think is the right model. Okay, so we now have over 3 million email activists. So what we did was we flipped the whole company. When people ask me, what are we? We're not a mobile phone company. We're a social change organization. We are not a mobile phone company. And for those of you who are executive directors of nonprofits, you probably spend 80% of your time raising money, right? That's the way it works. It's terrible, but that's the truth of the matter. And I say I spend 80% of my time raising money too, but the way I do that is I run a mobile phone company, right? The mobile phone company, pays for everything else. But by being really activist, we no longer do what we used to do. We don't rent lists from NRDC or sort of the normal groups. That's gone. It's all gone. We do the activism that we want to do, and then over time, those people become customers. They still stay activists, right? Most of the people are not customers. Most are activists, and that's just fine. So we've flipped the model entirely on its head. We start with activism. We used to actually be afraid of leading with activism. During the direct mail days, if we led with activism, we would get a lower response rate. Now, if we don't do our activism, we get no response rate. We would not exist without our activism. And it's very aggressive activism. Do you want to talk about that?
What do you do? How do you keep people engaged?
Okay. I'll give you some examples. So during the days of the Obama healthcare fight, one of the big fights was over the coverage of choice. And some of you remember Bart Stupak, who was the Democratic member of Congress from Michigan. Stupak Amendment, which would have banned coverage of abortion. There were 20 Democratic members of the House. This is not a partisan comment, Deb. This is just a true comment. 20 Democratic members of the House who had 100% ratings from Planned Parenthood who voted for the Stupak Amendment. Right? Planned Parenthood, they didn't do anything. We can't offend these people. We may need them later. And we love Planned Parenthood. This pissed us off. We think there needs to be accountability in the system. So we did an action, and we sent them these nice 20 people, all men, by the way, if anyone wants to count gender, over 200,000 little tiny metal coat hangers. And let me tell you, they didn't like that a bit. Nancy Pelosi didn't like that a bit, right? She called me up. What are you doing? Well, we're doing what you should have done, right? I mean, right? So this is... Those of you who are in California know that the oil industry tried to overturn our best in the world, not best in the country, best in the world, global warming law. Sadly, the environmental movement had no field capacity in California. No field capacity. No one was planning to do field, and we know from lots of evidence that's what works. So we opened 7 field offices and talked to over 500,000 voters on Prop 23.
Well, just stop there for a minute, Michael. How did you pay for that? Who paid for that?
Well, if we have any customers in the room, they helped pay for it. Thank you very much. And we raised money into a political committee. This also isn't partisan, Deb, because initiatives are legislation.
So, but the company itself, but not insubstantial resources into it.
And we had a lot of fun. I mean, I want to be really clear. This is fun. For any of you thinking about doing activism, this is fun. This isn't, I mean, it's hard, but it's not fun. I mean, it's easy to do.
Do you think you lost any customers because of it?
Absolutely, we lose customers.
Because of the activism?
We lose customers on every single thing we do. If we oppose invading Iraq, we lose customers. If we speak out against the Patriot Act, we lose customers. If we talk about Iran, we lose customers. We lose every single thing we do, we lose customers.
Do you run a
but we gain more. So some of you know Walt Fries, who at one point, right, was head of Ben & Jerry's, and we were having a conversation about this matter, even though Ben & Jerry's is not as activist as we are. And he said, you know, we would rather have 0.5% of the market composed of people who care passionately about what we do than 5% of people who just like the taste. So it has always been, since we learned the lesson, don't go light green, we want to go deep. We want people to raise their hand saying they're signing up for the whole thing. And the best way we know how to do that is good for the world anyway, which is the activism. But we absolutely, if you're afraid of losing customers, then you're just afraid.
Is that part of your calculation when you decide on an issue to take on?
No.
It isn't? Really?
No.
Good.
I mean, in some cases, we've lost thousands of customers. Mm-hmm. But net, I mean, why exist? Wow. I mean, you know.
That's a deeper question than I was looking for, actually.
There's got to be a point to the whole thing, right?
Absolutely.
The point is change.
Interesting.
That's the whole point.
Yep.
Can I do another one?
Yep, carry on.
All right, so we're doing a lot on the pipeline, right? Yeah, it's good.
This one I actually would like you to sort of lay out what you're doing on the pipeline, because I think it's a fascinating question, the call to action, other than getting arrested at the White House.
All right, so I have a personal quota of getting arrested once a decade.
You did it in style. I've never seen you in a tie. That's good.
And my kids were shocked at the tie. My wife wanted to know, where's your belt? But the answer is, they tell you not to wear a belt because they take it away before they put you in jail because they're afraid you'll hang yourself. So I was told not to.
When you hire people at CREDO, do you actually, ask for, are you an experienced arrestee, or is that not an employment requirement? I mean, you clearly are.
Joseph, did we ask you if you'd ever been arrested? Yeah. So
I don't think you can, actually, if
here's
you're arrested.
The answer is yes, we used to do that, and then we started to get some really scary answers. And so we stopped. Yeah, okay, so
let's talk about that XL.
So,
what are you doing? Or what have you done so far?
So the environmental movement, I'm going to speak in broad strokes, became kind of pathetic over the last 30 years. Not all of it, but just centralized, mainly hiring lawyers and caving in on most things. The worst of the groups, if anyone wants my opinion, is the Environmental Defense Fund, which is now run by hedge fund guys. But that's a whole other issue. And into this mix, around Keystone came Bill McKibben, who's a wonderful prophetic guy, pretty pessimistic, right, if the truth be told. And he issued a call to do civil disobedience at the White House because, the road was set. Obama was going to approve it. He still is probably going to approve it. He really wants to approve it. There's probably 300 former Obama campaign staffers, Clinton campaign staffers on the lobbyist payroll. I mean, this thing is really greased.
Lobbyist payroll for?
Trans-Canada Pipeline. I mean, it's terrible. And so we answered that call. 1,253 people got arrested, I think, in August and September 2011. Over half of those people came off our list. our list is really into, they want to step up, right? They're ready to step up. And of course, Obama then came to town. We welcomed him with 1,000 people.
Including a few of his main
Including some very big donors. And, you know, they don't like that. We got calls about that too, but that's the point. You want to get the calls. You don't get the calls, you know, like, why do it? So what we've done now is we've issued a call for a pledge of resistance. There have been prior pledge of resistances. Eric will remember some, I'm sure, which are triggered. So in this complicated process, if the State Department recommends approval, which they are likely to do in September or October, we have 60,000 people who've signed up to do civil disobedience. 60,000. I mean, if even a third of them do it, it's the biggest civil disobedience in American history. Now, I'm not saying that we're the coolest. What I say is the tools now exist. Over 1,000 people have volunteered to organize local acts of civil disobedience. You can't have a centralized thing like that. And people want to step up. They genuinely want to do more. They know things are going really badly, and most of the groups are not serving them well. So what has been good for us is that we have asked people to step up at a time when they want to. And I think all of us can do that. Do it in very different ways, but all of us can do that. I don't think we should underestimate how much people want to really do something. Now, not everybody wants to get arrested. I mean, there's no magic. You have to do it in the right way, in a dignified way. You have to do the inside politics as well as the outside politics. You have to do it all, but people want to step up.
How important are collaborations with other groups when you're doing these kinds of actions? Other nonprofit groups, activist groups, other businesses?
Well, that's a really complicated question. So you should always collaborate if you can. Most collaborations slow you down, right? I mean, let's just be blunt, right? So we work really well in small groups, 2 or 3 groups. Mm-hmm. So we work really well, say, with Rainforest Action Network. Their style is a lot like ours. I mean, if we decide to do something, we can turn something around in a day. Mm-hmm. Most groups, it takes a month. Then you miss the moment. So it's really important to do it with others, but you have to have like-minded others, or you just slow everything down too much. We have not found other businesses interested in doing similar things.
Have you looked for them, or?
Constantly. And it doesn't mean that we've talked to everybody. If anybody wants to join in on these things, wonderful, right? Love to do it.
So which are some of the groups that you have relied on in designing your actions? And
Ruckus Society is really great. The other 98 is really good, the New Bottom Line. We used to be very, very close to Acorn before they were murdered. We did a lot with Acorn. Mm-hmm. They were great. So the more somebody is quick and has field, mm-hmm. The better. The better.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So I want to ask you one more question. You may have more slides, I can't remember, but the question I want to ask is, there was a piece of legislation there was a decision by the Supreme Court that many progressives opposed vehemently in some cases, and called Citizens United. Yeah. This opened up the spigots for businesses to engage in politics, and pretty much the progressive community that had opposed and does oppose this decision, wants to see it reversed, has sat on the sidelines. You took a different tack when the decision went down, and why don't you tell us about what the company has done in the wake of Citizens United?
Okay. First of all, I don't think it made a big difference, right? I mean, the spigots were already open for corporate spending in elections, right? So if I wanted as a business to give money, I could give unlimited amounts of money through trade groups. I mean, unlimited, undisclosed, do anything you want. All Citizens United did was make it a little more visible, mm-hmm. But it really didn't fundamentally change anything. It scared a lot of politicians. So we opposed it. We're in favor of public financing of elections, sort of the normal list of things. But we decided, and we're in favor of corporate disclosure of campaign contributions. So you may have seen the article in the New York Times just a couple days ago where the SEC is considering forcing publicly traded companies to disclose all of their contributions, including those to trade groups like the Chamber of Commerce. They said there were 400,000 public comments on that. We generated over 200,000 of them. So what we did was we formed our own super PAC. We didn't hide it. We did the CREDO super PAC, so there was utterly no confusion. It wasn't Americans for Prosperity. It was the CREDO super PAC. And we did an all-volunteer field operation and defeated 5, watch how careful I am now, Deb, 5 Tea Party members of Congress, right? And including Alan West and lots of other, just, and we just announced this week our first effort of this cycle, which is after a very prominent member of the House Intelligence Committee. I emphasize that because it's Michelle Bachmann. Yeah.
It's almost oxymoronic.
Yeah.
And in this case, you built field operations, which was kind of an unusual thing for super PACs to do, as I understand it.
It's unusual for most campaigns to do. In all these cases, remember, we were defeating people, not in favor of people, because our experience as politicians, the decay curve for integrity in DC is very rapid. Really, really rapid. Mm-hmm. So we're just defeating people, and our experience is that most campaign consultants get paid sort of commissions for TV. So everything we do has been sort of analytically driven, tested, and door-to-door knocking, volunteer phone calls, that's what works. So that's what we did.